I'll never forget the first night I worked as a night receptionist at the Misty Vale Hotel. It's been months since then, but even now, I get chills every time I think about it. I'd been desperate for a job, any job. So when I got the call saying I'd been hired, I didn't hesitate. The hotel was in the middle of nowhere, perched high in the mountains, and honestly, that sounded perfect. Quiet, peaceful, easy, or so I thought. From the moment I walked in, something felt off. The place was old, with creaky wooden floors, faded carpets, and the kind of dim lighting that made everything look like it was stuck in another era. And then there was the manager, Donna Vera, this little old lady who handed me a list of rules without even looking me in the eye. "Follow these exactly, and you'll be fine," she said. No explanation, no smile, just a stern warning. At first, I thought the rules were just weird. Lock all the doors by 10:30 p.m. Even if someone is outside, don't talk when the phone rings between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. Keep the lights on the third floor on at all times. It all sounded ridiculous, but I was tired and broke, so I didn't argue. That first night started quietly enough. Checking in one guest, making coffee, scrolling on my phone. Around 1 a.m., the phone rang. I froze. The number one rule was to answer but not say a word, so I picked it up, pressed it to my ear, and stayed silent. 30 seconds later, I hung up just like the instructions said. But those 30 seconds, they felt like forever. There was no sound on the other end. No breathing, nothing. But the longer I held the phone, the more I felt this strange, icy pressure, like something was leaning over me, listening. After hanging up, I tried to shake off the uneasiness. I told myself it was just nerves, new job, creepy location, overactive imagination. But then, at around 2 a.m., I started hearing footsteps. They were faint at first, like someone pacing on the floor above me. I remembered the rule about ignoring sounds from the top floor, but curiosity got the better of me. The hotel's top floor was supposed to be closed off and used for years. It's probably an animal, I thought, but even as I tried to rationalize it, my pulse was racing. Grabbing the flashlight from the desk, I headed up the creaky staircase. Every step seemed louder than the last, and by the time I reached the third floor, I was holding my breath. The hallway was pitch dark. I'd forgotten to check the lights earlier, and now they were all off. The rule about keeping the third floor lights on suddenly felt a lot more important. As I fumbled for the switch, the footsteps stopped. Not faded away, just stopped. My hand froze midair, and for a second I felt completely exposed, like someone or something was standing right there in the dark, watching me. The light flickered to life, revealing an empty hallway, lined with old, closed doors. Everything was quiet again, except for a faint, earthy smell, like damp soil or rotting wood. It was coming from somewhere farther down the hall. Against my better judgment, I followed it. As I moved further down the hall, the smell grew stronger, almost suffocating. It seemed to seep out from under one of the doors, a plain wooden one at the very end of the corridor. I wanted to turn back. Every instinct in me screamed to leave it alone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to see what was behind it. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob. It was ice cold, and as soon as I touched it, the lights flickered again. A soft creaking sound echoed from somewhere behind me. I spun around, shining the flashlight down the corridor, but it was empty. The door at the end of the hall, though, was now slightly ajar. The smell hit me like a punch when I stepped closer. I shone the flashlight into the room, but it barely cut through the darkness inside. It was small and empty, except for a single chair sitting in the middle of the room, facing a blank wall. Something about it felt horribly wrong. My chest tightened, and I felt this overwhelming urge to leave, like whatever was in that room didn't want me there. But as I backed away, the chair creaked, shifting slightly, even though there was no one sitting in it. That was it for me. I turned and bolted back down the hall, my footsteps echoing louder than ever in the suffocating silence. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I slammed the door to the third floor shut and locked it without thinking. My hand was shaking so badly, I could barely hold the keys. The air in the lobby felt heavier now, and I couldn't tell if it was just my panic or something else. I tried to calm myself down. pacing behind the reception desk, but that's when I noticed something else. Every clock in the lobby had stopped. My phone, the old wall clock, even the digital one on the desk. All of them were frozen at exactly 2:13 a.m. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but the landline on the desk suddenly started ringing again. My stomach dropped. I didn't want to pick it up, but the rules were clear. If the phone rings between 1 and 3 a.m., I had to answer. With every ring, the sound seemed to grow louder, more urgent, like it was demanding to be answered. When I finally lifted the receiver, my ears were met with the same suffocating silence as before. But this time it wasn't empty. Faintly, I could hear a whisper, just a single word repeated over and over. Leave. I slammed the phone down, my heart pounding in my chest. The whisper felt too real, like it wasn't just coming from the line, but from right beside me. For a moment, I stood frozen, listening to the oppressive silence of the lobby. Then, as if to shatter the illusion of calm, the lobby doors rattled violently, like someone or something was trying to force them open. I glanced at the clock again, even though I knew it wasn't moving. Still 2:13 a.m. The rattling stopped abruptly, and I heard 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the glass. I wanted to look, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. The rule about not opening the doors replayed in my mind like a warning siren. Instead, I crouched behind the desk, clutching the flashlight like it would somehow protect me. The knocks came again, harder this time. Then a voice, low and gravelly, called out, "Let me in." It didn't sound human. There was something wrong about it, like it was trying to mimic how a person speaks, but didn't quite know how. My breath hitched as I realized the voice wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the phone I just hung up. I don't know how long I stayed there, crouched behind the desk, but it felt like an eternity. The knocking stopped, but the silence was worse. I was too scared to move, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the lobby anymore. Slowly, I peeked over the edge of the desk, and my heart nearly stopped. The front doors were still locked, but there was a figure standing just inside the glass. I couldn't make out a face. Its head was lowered, shadowed, but it was tall and unnaturally still, like a mannequin. I ducked back down, squeezing my eyes shut, trying to convince myself it wasn't real. My mind raced through the rules, desperate to remember if there was anything about this. Don't open the doors. Don't look at the front doors during the lantern ritual. But nothing about what to do if someone or something got inside. I stayed frozen, clutching the flashlight so tightly my fingers went numb. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving across the wooden floor of the lobby. They weren't heavy, but they echoed unnaturally, like the sound didn't belong in this world. The footsteps grew louder, each one dragging out the suffocating silence between them. They were heading toward the reception desk. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My whole body was screaming at me to run, but where would I go? Slowly, the sound stopped just on the other side of the desk. I could feel it, whatever it was, standing there. The air felt colder, heavier, like it was pressing down on me. For a moment, there was nothing but that dreadful silence. And then it spoke. The same distorted, gravelly voice from the phone, but closer this time, said my name. Alex. The way it said it made my stomach twist. It wasn't just a sound, it felt like it was pulling the name out of me, like it had plucked it straight from my head. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. The flashlight in my hand flickered, and before I could stop myself, I looked up over the desk. It was gone. The lobby was empty, but the air still felt wrong, and when I glanced at the clock, it had moved. 4:44 a.m. I almost didn't believe it. 4:44 a.m. The exact time of one of the rules. My shaking hands fumbled as I grabbed the flashlight, barely able to keep hold of it. I had to shine the green light on the founder's portrait for 30 seconds. That's what the list said. My body moved on autopilot, desperate to follow the instructions. The flashlight's green beam cut through the dim light of the lobby as I aimed it at the portrait. The founder's stern face stared back at me from behind the glass frame, but something was wrong. The background of the portrait wasn't the same as before. It used to show the hotel in its prime, a bright, welcoming image. Now it looked darker. The building was in ruins, surrounded by dense forest, with shadows that seemed to writhe and shift. My hands trembled, but I kept the light steady, counting down in my head. That's when I saw it. Reflected in the glass was a figure standing behind me, shrouded in darkness. I couldn't make out its face, but its shape didn't look human. Too tall, too thin, its limbs slightly bent. The knocking on the front door started again, louder and more frantic this time, but I didn't dare turn around. My heart felt like it would burst out of my chest as I kept the flashlight steady, forcing myself to stay focused on the portrait. The knocks on the door grew more violent, shaking the glass in its frame, but I knew better than to break the rule. 30 seconds. I just had to hold out for 30 seconds. The figure in the reflection didn't move, but I could feel its presence, heavy and cold, like it was leaning closer to me. Each second stretched into an eternity, and I could swear I heard it breathing, slow, deep breaths that seemed to match the rhythm of the knocking. When the 30 seconds finally passed, I turned off the flashlight and dropped it onto the desk, too terrified to look behind me. The knocking stopped instantly, and the air in the room grew still, almost suffocatingly quiet. I stayed frozen, staring at the portrait, trying to steady my breathing. The founder's face was different now. His expression had changed, his once stern gaze now twisted into a grim smile that sent a shiver down my spine. And just as I thought it was over, the landline phone rang again, breaking the silence. I didn't want to answer, but the rules, the damn rules. My fingers hovered over the phone, trembling as the ringing echoed through the empty lobby. I didn't want to pick it up, but the rules were burned into my brain. Slowly, I lifted the receiver to my ear, and at first, it was just silence again. Deep, oppressive silence. Then, the whisper came back, clearer this time, cutting through the static. "You shouldn't have looked," it said, the words sharp and guttural, like they were being dragged out of a throat that didn't belong to anything living. My breath caught, and I slammed the phone down, the sound echoing in the stillness. Before I could gather my thoughts, I heard footsteps again, this time coming from the third floor. They were slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud, like the entire building was amplifying each step. The lights in the lobby flickered, and the temperature dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath clouding in front of me. I knew I should stay put, but my body moved on its own. Grabbing the flashlight, I found myself heading toward the stairs, one shaky step at a time. My mind screamed at me to stop, to turn around, but it was like something was pulling me closer, guiding me against my will. Each step felt heavier than the last, like the air itself was trying to push me back. But I kept climbing. The third floor door loomed ahead, slightly ajar even though I'd locked it earlier. A faint light spilled through the crack, pulsating like a heartbeat. My hand hesitated on the handle, cold sweat dripping down my temples. I didn't want to open it, but the footsteps on the other side grew louder, more frantic, as if whoever, or whatever, was waiting knew I was there. Against every instinct, I pushed the door open. The hallway stretched before me, bathed in that eerie flickering light. Every door was wide open, and the earthy smell was overpowering now, like I'd stepped into a freshly dug grave. At the far end of the corridor, where I'd seen the strange room earlier, stood the figure. It was tall, unnaturally so, its head brushing against the ceiling. Its arms hung long and limp, the fingers ending in sharp, claw-like tips. The flashlight in my hand flickered wildly, and for a brief second, I thought I saw its face, or rather, the lack of one. Smooth, featureless skin stretched where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. It tilted its head, as if curious, before taking a slow, deliberate step toward me. My body refused to move as the figure stepped closer, its distorted limbs moving with an unnatural, jerking rhythm. The light in the hallway dimmed with every step it took, until I was left standing in near total darkness. My flashlight gave one last weak flicker before it died completely, plunging me into silence and shadow. I couldn't even scream. My throat felt tight, like something unseen was gripping it. The only sound was its slow, deliberate footsteps closing the distance between us. Suddenly, I felt a cold breath against the back of my neck, though the figure was still in front of me. Or had it moved? My mind spiraled into panic, and I stumbled backward, hitting the wall behind me. The earthy smell was overwhelming now, making it hard to breathe. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to will myself out of whatever nightmare this was. And then it stopped. The air grew still. The sound of footsteps vanished, and for a brief, disorienting moment, I thought it was over. But when I opened my eyes, I wasn't in the hallway anymore. I was standing in the room at the end of the corridor, the one with the chair. It was the only thing in the room, facing the blank wall, but this time, I wasn't alone. The figure was there, sitting in the chair, its head slowly turning toward me. Its faceless void seemed to stare directly into me. And the last thing I remember before everything went black was a single word, whispered in that same distorted voice. Stay. I woke up in the lobby the next morning, slumped behind the reception desk like nothing had happened. The clocks were ticking again. The lobby was quiet, and the phone was dead. When I checked the logbook, there were no entries for the night, no guests, no phone calls, no footsteps. It was like the entire night had been erased. I quit that day without telling anyone why. But every now and then, I wake up in the middle of the night, and I swear I hear the sound of footsteps above me.